Victor the Fox arrived in a new town and quickly secured a house for himself and his wife. Victor was a notorious con artist, often referred to as the Fox, for his cunning ways of deceiving wealthy individuals and merchants. His sharp tongue was his most powerful weapon, enabling him to manipulate even the shrewdest of traders. Often, his wife collaborated with him in his schemes. The next day, Victor went to the town square with his donkey, whose mouth he had filled with gold coins. Once there, he began shouting at the top of his lungs, "Look, a donkey that spits gold." Soon, people gathered around to witness the miraculous donkey. Each time the donkey brayed, a piece of gold would appear, mesmerizing the crowd. Traders, eager to own such a magical creature, began offering large sums of money for the donkey. But Victor rejected all offers, including one from Edward, the town's wealthiest merchant, who proposed 50,000 gold coins. Victor, however, refused, holding out for a higher price. After much haggling, Victor and Edward agreed on a sum of 100,000 gold coins. Victor handed over the donkey, saying, "Take good care of him. He's my beloved pet." Edward, delighted with his purchase, took the donkey home, anticipating a fortune in gold. To his dismay, the donkey produced nothing. Realizing he had been swindled, Edward set out to find Victor. After much searching, he finally located Victor's house. Furious, Edward knocked on the door. Victor's wife answered, and Edward demanded angrily, "Where is your con artist husband?" She replied calmly, "Why do you call my husband a con artist?" Edward retorted, "He sold me a donkey that supposedly spits gold for 100,000 coins, but it's a fraud." Victor's wife laughed and said, "And you believed a donkey could spit gold?" Edward, embarrassed, replied, "If he's not here, I will return later." "Don't leave," she said. "I'll send our dog to fetch him for you." Edward thought she had lost her mind. How could a dog accomplish such a task? But she called the dog and whispered in its ear, "Go find Victor and tell him Edward is here." The dog dashed off, and after half an hour, Victor arrived with the dog. "Apologies for my delay," Victor said. "The dog reached me late." Edward, amazed by the dog's apparent intelligence, immediately wanted to buy it. Victor, sensing another opportunity, said, "I'm sorry, my friend. I can't sell this dog. He's my cherished pet, and I spent 10 years training him." Edward persisted, offering to pay handsomely and promising to give the dog a luxurious life. After hours of negotiation, Victor agreed to sell the dog for 75,000 gold coins. In truth, Victor and his wife had planned this all along, using a similar-looking dog to fool Edward. When Edward returned home, he tested the dog by whispering in its ear, "Go to our neighbor Simon and bring him here." The dog ran off but never returned. Furious, Edward visited Simon, only to learn the dog had not gone there. Realizing he had been duped again, Edward's anger boiled over. The next day, Edward, accompanied by several men, went to Victor's house. Confronting Victor's wife, he shouted, "Where is your deceitful husband? I am the wealthiest merchant, yet he has fooled me twice." As Edward fumed, Victor entered the house, warmly welcoming Edward and his men. Turning to his wife, he asked, "Have you prepared lunch for our guest, Edward?" She replied arrogantly, "Since when do I prepare food? Don't you have any shame? They are our guests." Infuriated, Victor stabbed his wife, killing her instantly. Merchant Edward began shouting, "What have you done, you fool? We don't want food or drink. Why did you kill her?" Victor, the con artist, calmly looked at Edward and said, "Don't worry, she'll come back to life." "How is that possible, you idiot?" Edward asked. Victor pulled a flute out of his pocket and began to play it. Within moments, his wife rose as if nothing had happened. Edward was stunned by the flute and exclaimed, "I want to buy it." Victor replied, "I can't sell it. It's an heirloom passed down from my ancestors." After much negotiation, Victor eventually sold the flute to Edward for 300,000 gold coins. As Edward left, Victor's wife laughed and said, "What a fool! He fell for the fake death trick." especially since I was just using a bag filled with red liquid to mimic blood. Victor laughed along with her. Meanwhile, Edward returned home and immediately decided to test the flute. He stabbed one of his men and began to play the flute, but the man did not move. Edward grew anxious and played the flute again, yet the man remained motionless. Frustrated, Edward called for doctors to try to save the man. Realizing he had been tricked again, Edward gathered his men to capture Victor. This time, Edward and his men were determined not to let Victor talk his way out of trouble. They stormed into his house, grabbed him before he could say a word, and stuffed him into a large cloth sack. Their plan was to throw him into a lake full of man-eating fish, located 4 days away from the city. Every day, one of the men took turns carrying the sack. On the third day, just before dawn, a shepherd spotted the sack moving on the ground. Curious, he approached and opened it, releasing Victor. Victor said to the shepherd, "Don't be afraid." The shepherd asked, "Why are you inside this sack?" Victor replied, "Those men work for the king. The princess has fallen in love with me, but I love my cousin and refused to marry the princess. The king sent his men to force me to marry her. What do you think? Would you like to take my place? You look a lot like me, and you'd marry the princess, while I could marry the woman I love." The shepherd eagerly agreed. In exchange, Victor took the shepherd's flock of sheep and tied the shepherd inside the sack. An hour later, Edward's men resumed their journey. Once they reached the lake, they threw the sack into the water, where hungry fish quickly devoured the shepherd. Believing Victor was finally dead, Edward and his men returned to the city feeling victorious. However, upon their return, they were shocked to see Victor herding sheep nearby. They rushed to him, shouting, "How are you here? We just threw you into the lake." Victor laughed and said, "Something incredible happened. When you threw me into the lake, a mermaid appeared and gave me a small chest of gold. I used the gold to buy these sheep. She also told me that her sister lives at the bottom of the lake and gives out even larger chests of gold." Greedy for the promised treasure, Edward and his men immediately jumped into the lake, where the fish devoured them. This story is filled with lessons and morals that can benefit us in our personal lives. Share the lessons you've learned from this tale in the comments, and we'll see you next time with another story.